everybody. Welcome to Church History for Chumps. My name is John Simon, and I'm here with my good friend,
Thomas Welch.
And hey, guys, if you ever feel distant from you and Tommy, just remember that if you ever go outside and look at the moon, we'll be looking at the same moon.
You said you and Tommy. Like, but people don't feel distant from you? I'm not thinking about our followers when I look at the moon.
Go outside right now. Look at the moon. I'm right there. I'm there with you. We're all
just John.
We're with you. We're with you. We're looking at the same moon. Hey, we're here for another episode.
Somebody just got so stoked.
History. Yeah. Someone's like, "Oh, sweet. Same moon as John and Tom? Boy golly."
Mm-hmm.
If this was Dune, doesn't Dune have like 2 moons?
I think so.
Did you ever start reading the books?
No. I did give in after watching the second movie and just like read all the Wikipedia articles about the whole franchise, because I was like, I'm not going to read these, especially after the second one ended and I could see the trajectory of the story. Mm-hmm. I was like, I don't think that this is actually like totally my jam, but I want to know more.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you questions about it, but I realized if we did, I'd be spoiling the whole movie for people, so I'm going to take that offline.
All right.
Yeah, that's fair. Tommy, give us a shout out for today. Let's give me a shout out, a letter of the alphabet. Yeah, what's an underrated letter of the alphabet?
Underrated. U.
Aw, thanks, man. Yeah. I was thinking I. That's good. All right, sweet. Well, hey, let's get crack-a-lackin', and you're kind of steering the ship today, right?
Yeah, dude.
All right. Well, this is a topic that I know that you're really passionate about, yeah, I hope that our listeners don't get too bummed out when they hear about this.
No, yeah. I mean, you may have wondered about this yourself. You kind of probably already know what we're going to talk about if you read the title of the podcast, but I've wondered before, when did we start using grape juice in communion? In particular, I think in American churches, it's a really common thing.
Yeah.
In Baptist and Methodist circles especially. And I had heard rumors that it went back to Mr. Welch himself of Welch's grape juice. And so I did a little research.
A conspiracy.
It's a little bit conspiracy theory. It felt like a conspiracy theory. When I first started researching this, I was like, this is going to be like almost like a true crime episode.
Oh my gosh.
But I think after reading it, I had a lot more sympathy, I think, for like the origins and why it happened, which we've hammered this idea over and over again on this podcast, but everything in church history happens for cultural reasons. And there's some really strong cultural reasons that, whether or not you agree with them, at least make the adoption of this practice easier to understand. But there's kind of some fun stuff to find out about along the way. So,
okay, I've got a couple of stand-in titles for this episode. Heard it through the grapevine.
Oh, good one.
Or how about this one? That's not grape.
I thought that was a throwback to when it sounded like I was just absolutely
bong ripping.
Yeah, ripping it.
Yeah. Well, it was an homage, I'd say.
Yeah. That's not great. Well, today we're talking about Thomas Bramwell Welch. This is a man who, if you want to envision someone in your mind, just imagine the picture on his Wikipedia article.
Whoa.
Just an old man with a full head of hair that goes down to his shoulders and a beard that goes down to his chest, all white.
No mustache.
Yeah.
He looks a little like, if you put a hat on him, you could convince me this was the Quaker Oats guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see it. So this guy was born in England, actually, even though his story is very American. He was born in Glastonbury, England on December 31st, 1825. You know what they say about Thomas Welch?
What's that?
He's almost born in 1826.
I've heard that. I've heard people say that. Yeah.
That was my attempt at a John Simon joke. I was totally channeling you.
I love it, dude. I want to keep it going.
So he was born in England, And his family immigrated to America when he was 9 years old.
Okay.
When he was 17, he joined the Wesleyan Methodist Church, which at the time was known as the Wesleyan Methodist Connection with an X. Sounds very like early 2000s.
I was going to say, that's awesome.
Church planting,
yeah.
or 90s kind of.
Dude, that pastor's got bleached tips.
Oh,
you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Frosted tips.
Yeah. He's wearing a puka shell necklace.
That's right. Welcome to the Connection.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This was when I first started to be like, okay, this guy was kind of cool. He during his late teens, he was active in helping run the Underground Railroad in smuggling slaves from the South up into Canada.
Oh, solid.
And there was a lot. Apparently, there was multiple Methodists, or a lot of Methodists, that were engaged in helping run the Underground Railroad at the time.
All right.
He went to seminary early at 19 years old. He graduated seminary and became an ordained Wesleyan minister. Mm-hmm. And then he pastored in a few different churches for, I think it was about 10 years. And he lost his voice. And he had to step back from the pastorate.
Dang.
So he went back to school. As
Did you
one
say why he
does.
lost his voice?
I'm assuming he was just preaching fiery sermons.
He's talking too loud.
I guess. Calm down, bro. Yeah, so he went back to school as one would if you just lost your vocation at 30 years old. Mm-hmm. And he became a dentist.
Oh, boy. This story's taking a turn. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't like that one bit.
Nobody likes dentists.
No, and he invented a sugary drink. This dude was poisoning the well.
That's what I thought, dude. That's kind of, I was like, there's got to be some sort of connection between...
This is a true crime podcast. We need to add some
spooky
eerie music.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk to Ray about it. Ray?
Spooky time. So this is where like his story, at least for me, became like a little bit more difficult to track, but there's a couple things going on at the same time, and hopefully these threads will come together. In 1864, the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which I believe he would have been like a member of, they made a strong recommendation that, quote, in all cases, the pure juice of the grape be used in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. Now, what they mean by that is grape juice that has not been fermented. That's what they mean by the pure juice of the grape. Now, I'll talk in a minute about why they were saying that, why that was a recommendation.
Does it rhyme with schmabolition?
Yes. Well, not quite.
Ooh.
We're not there quite yet in history, but it's everything that leads up to
that.
I
see. This was kind of what got the wheels of abolition turning.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. So 1 year later, in 1865, Welch himself relocated to a place called Vineland, New Jersey. Man. Now, if that name sounds interesting, considering what will become this man's business, listen to what Vineland is. Mm-hmm. Vineland was a town started by a man named Charles K. Landis, and he purchased 30,000 acres of land, and then later on he bought some more in 1874. In 1874 he bought some more land. I'm sorry, I was reading my notes and confused myself. Basically, what he was doing in buying this land and creating a town is he was trying to create a non-alcoholic utopian society. Those are literally the words I found written about this town. It was supposed to be this alcohol-free utopian society where they were going to be growing, in particular, grapes together. I think there was a lot of people growing grapes, Vineland, and encouraging progressive thinking. And when I first read that, I was like, wait, he moved to no wine utopia town? Like, yeah. And it was really interesting, and it sent me on a little bit of a rabbit trail, and I found that what was going on was this was one of the very first temperance towns. Oh, have you ever heard of temperance towns?
I have.
I had never heard of this. So they were towns that were planned and financed and populated by followers of the temperance movement, which I'll talk more about in a second, but there's a bunch of them, including, some of them have names that make sense, like Prohibition Park in New York.
Okay, yeah.
Temperance Town, Cardiff.
Yeah.
But I was surprised to see Greeley, Colorado on there, which is where my grandpa grew up. It's where my dad was born.
Yeah, he grew up in a temperance town.
Yeah.
Was it still temperate?
Probably not. I'm sure that there was like some influences of that there, maybe.
Yeah.
But by the time my grandpa would have been born in the 30s, then that's a ways off probably.
Well, I know there's still dry counties. You've heard of those, right?
Right.
Yeah, and those are still around today, but I think they're probably not quite as restrictive as a temperance town.
Right. Yeah, I don't think at least today Greeley's just a regular old place.
Yeah, and because I've been through dry counties when I was visiting my dad's family in the South, and like a lot of them are like no alcohol sales on Sunday or something like that, or they won't sell you alcohol after like 8 p.m. or something like that.
Right.
I'm sure there's a few that are like straight up nothing.
Right.
But I don't know.
And that what you just described is kind of indicative of what the temperance movement was. So there's kind of stages, like as you work your way through the 1800s, what started to form in actually I think had some roots in England as well, as the Industrial Revolution created a lot of work that required the operation of heavy machinery. There was a growing need for guys that weren't kind of buzzed to run that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there was a little bit of a push for temperance, which is not the same thing as teetotalism. Temperance is just like a cultural warning and like strong recommendation to either just abstain from alcohol entirely or at least be more temperate with how we're using it.
Yeah, it's just the chill out movement, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But alcohol had been a really strong part of American culture for forever. I mean, I read a quote that said in 1767 the average New England family was consuming 7 barrels of hard cider annually, which equates to about 35 gallons per person.
Hard cider?
Because of how much apple tree production there was. And there was companies that were like kind of in charge of like giving land to settlers. And part of the requirement for the settlers was to plant like so many apple trees per acre.
Yeah.
So there's tons of apples, and like hard cider was kind of just like the standard drink, it sounds like.
That's
in
so interesting.
Early America. Yeah.
Yeah, that's because like now hard cider, I mean, it's still pretty popular. You can get it at like a corner store, but it's kind of like the niche beer alternative,
right,
you know?
Right.
So it's not like, yeah, I would never have expected that to be like the common drink of the day. That's really interesting.
Yep.
Dang.
So the temperance movement was really important to a lot of Christians at this time, but not just Christians. There was a strong overlap with the women's suffrage movement. Okay. Because leaders in the women's suffrage movement already had a well-known ability for activism, and women were in particular interested in the temperance movement because drunk husbands have a negative effect on your life.
Yeah, I was wondering if you were gonna point that out or if you read that, because I was immediately like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that people fighting for like more like valuable treatment of women would also not want their husbands to be drunks.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really
interesting.
And
the more I read about this time in American history, the more it seems like there actually was a pretty bad alcoholism problem.
Yeah.
Like just lots. It seems like it was actually the norm. The more I read, for most men to be under the influence a lot, and I'm sure drinking in excess. If you think about like, this just occurred to me, but like, if you didn't have to worry about getting a DUI, and like you didn't have to drive a car everywhere to go most places, and it was a non-commuter society before cars and stuff, like how much more willing would most people be to just be kind of riding through the day buzzed.
Yeah.
For one, it's probably a little less of a problem, like bringing that into question if you're just walking everywhere.
Yeah.
Like day drinking is kind of a problem in our like culture where everybody drives cars around. Like we want people to be sober while they're driving. But anyway, it seems like it was a problem, and the temperance movement kind of snowballs in some places into full-blown teetotalism, which is not drinking alcohol at all, and even taking like vows not to. And people who were adherents to teetotalism were instructed to only drink pure water, and the teetotalists were known as the Pure Water Army.
Wow, what a dorky title!
It reminds me of the hardcore kids that I knew.
The Pure Water, yeah. They were just straight edge before it was cool. Yeah, the Pure Water Army. Shout out to the PWA. Yeah. That's so funny.
They encountered some resistance at this time. This was hilarious. This is a quote that I read that I liked. Considering drinking to be an important part of their cultures, German and Irish immigrants resisted the movement.
Well, I was thinking that because like a lot of these dudes, like there's a lot of fresh off the boat immigrants around this time, and it's not just that America had a heavy drinking culture, it's that there were countries with heavy drinking cultures that were immigrating here.
Yep.
So it makes sense that other people from other countries would be like, I'm not putting down my mead.
Right.
Yeah.
And just 100 years before, maybe about 150 years before this, if you remember when we did the William Wilberforce episode, one of the things that they were trying to reform in England was the use of gin. Like people drank enormous amounts of gin. Like alcoholism was a massive problem in the early 1700s in England. And so it's like all these people are like descended from and moving over from these European countries with really, really strong drinking cultures. And we're just 1 or 2 generations down the line in this kind of new America, this New England. And it makes sense that there was an unhealthy relationship with alcohol.
And these dudes were going ham on gin, which means that they were desperate. Like if I tasted
drink of the poor.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because dude, if I tasted apple cider or hard cider after drinking gin all my life, I'd be like, "This is
I am
best
in the New
thing."
Jerusalem, baby.
That's right.
They were post-mill all day.
Dude, Manifest Destiny was right. We found God's country with all these apples.
That's great. Oh, baby. So that's a lot of the context for what's going on, like why there was like whole towns of people that were gathering together and swearing off alcohol. And so after he moves to Vineland, he becomes a communion attendant at the Methodist church that he attended there, which, all the strings are coming together here. I hope you see. It was already really common with the Wesleyan Methodists, like 25 years before Welch started making grape juice. It was really common for them to be using unfermented wine, which, to be honest, I don't even know what that is.
Yeah.
There was a lot of study that was attempted at this time to show that the wine that is referenced in the Bible is not actual wine, or at least that there's the use of both in the Bible. And when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, that he did not make wine. And he didn't make wine at Cana either.
Yeah.
I think it's not possible to show that, but there was scholars that were at least trying to bring that in line with what was going on culturally, and to like not have this confliction or this seemed confliction between the Bible and where the culture needed to go.
So let me get this right. Ray, re-cue the spooky music for me, man. So you've got Tommy Welch over here, and he is a pastor turned dentist, where he's gonna profit off of all these kids sucking down this sweet grape nectar. He's also a communion steward, whatever the heck that is, and all of a sudden he's just like, hey guys, I mean, I don't know, I've started kind of playing around with this. You know, it's kind of like wine, but it's sweeter. It doesn't get you buzzed. We can give it to our kids. Like, you're right. Everything is coming. He lives in Vineland, New Jersey. Like, I'm seeing motive. I'm seeing modus operandi. Like, this dude is about to be guilty. He's got the hammer in the ballroom with the rope.
So that was some solid detective work.
Thank you,
Detective Simon. However, I did read that he never profited from his grape juice sales. Now, his family certainly did. This is where it starts getting interesting. So, there was this need for unfermented wine because you had these big denominations going, we're not going to use wine at all costs. We really would rather you use unfermented wine or grape juice. The problem is, if you leave grape juice laying around, it'll turn into wine. Mm-hmm. So now this is where I didn't get all the way down to the bottom of this mystery to determine whether he invented this process or not. But this is right around the time that the pasteurization process was discovered or invented by, I'm pretty sure it's like John Pasture. Like,
oh my God.
Yeah, this is where you're like, I think we live in a simulation.
Yeah. Tom Welch and John Pasture. These guys are just us.
It's Louis Pasture.
Okay.
So Louis Pasture had figured out how to pasteurize milk, and I read something that made me wonder if he had figured out that he could apply this process to grapes. I'm pretty sure that this guy was the one who figured it out, but Thomas Welch really picks up on that practice, and basically he discovers that there's something that you can do to the grapes that'll make sure that they'll never ferment. That's why if you buy grape juice at the store,
it'll never turn into wine.
It's not going to turn into wine. It's going to grow a little thin layer of mold on the top. And
that's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. I didn't know. Yeah, because I guess, like, to me, it made sense. Yeah, I did not know that wine that was pressed and left alone, or I'm sorry, that grapes that were pressed and left alone would naturally turn into wine. So it's interesting that, like, grape juice actually came very, very long after wine, because you had to affect the process to stop it from becoming alcohol, essentially. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he had tried to, I think, get a, like, Welch's grape juice kind of off the ground, or maybe he used it in the town that he was in. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. Later on, in 1875, his son, Charles E. Welch,
Chucky Welch,
also a dentist.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Moves to Vineland and really wants to get this grape business up off the ground, and he pushes it hard.
The harvest is ripe.
Yep. Charles is the one that kind of strikes me as more of like the salesman kind of guy, that he saw like the potential here. Okay. And he had a lot of success because of the growing temperance movement, which before long turns into the full-blown Prohibition era. And so it was kind of, there's not much left to tell of the story other than Welch's grape juice company became highly successful, and enjoyed, at least for a time, a season in which wine was culturally not favored. There's a story of like some sort of important like state dinner that occurred one time where grape juice, like pasteurized grape juice, was served instead of wine. Obviously, during the Prohibition era, people would have been drinking this if they were obeying the laws. But it solidified in American church history this, what I will say is a novel use of grape juice substituted for wine in the Lord's Supper. Yeah. And I thought it might be fun for us to chop it up over that question a little bit now. Maybe kind of analyze what could be gained and what could be lost by using grape juice instead of wine, or in the case of a lot of churches, maybe using both.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well, I'll say this first. When you first told me about what the topic was going to be, I was initially like, no, I mean, I loved the idea, but I was also a little worried that like this was going to come across as like
a hit piece.
Yeah, kind of like condescending to our Baptist, non-denom, Methodist brethren. But I think the opposite happened. I think that having understood the context of just because I think you're absolutely right. The reason we look back on the abolitionist movement, I think kind of with this attitude of they were a bunch of prudes who just didn't want people to have a good time. But you're right. Like, this was the early part of the industrial movement, and like it was very unsafe for you to like be operating in your workplace being drunk. But also, I'm sure that things like domestic abuse were probably through the roof because of this too. Yep. So yeah, rather than like laughing at all the Baptists, I'm like, dang, I actually get it. It makes sense why they made that shift. Yeah,
there's bigger cultural things behind it other than just kind of a dim view of alcohol, which I think is the problem today. Like when this conversation comes up, I oftentimes hear really, really poor, unbiblical views being espoused of like alcohol and its use. Our friend Josh Palmer, I heard a sermon that he preached recently, or it was kind of like a little sermonette on like the glories of wine, but also like the dangers of it. And he kind of surveyed everything that the Bible has to say about wine. And it's not something that is cut and dry as like wine good or wine bad.
Yeah.
When we look to the scriptures, if we're just talking about the alcohol question, the Bible is really clear that drunkenness is a sin. The Bible doesn't use categories like disease categories like alcoholism. It just calls people drunkards if they abuse alcohol. And there's a lot to say throughout, I think, probably every genre of scripture concerning the abuse of alcohol. But also every genre of scripture speaks really highly of wine and alcohol and its effects. For good and the glory of God, and there's a lot of symbolism tied up in it as well.
Yeah,
which is, I think, the larger question concerning communion. I don't think that. So I grew up in a church where there was never wine in communion.
Same.
I don't think that means that we weren't taking communion. I do think that it means that we were a lot of the value and symbolism of the Lord's Supper, which drives a lot of the nourishment that is provided to Christians, was lost because of the use of grape juice. I'm like, well, let's talk about some of that symbolism for a second.
Yeah.
Some of the things that you have with red wine that you don't have with white wine or grape juice or water or, we've all heard those cringe youth group stories of Mountain Dew and Oreos.
Yeah.
What you have is this cup full of a red liquid, which reminds us of Christ's blood. Wine is both sweet and bitter at the same time.
That. Yeah.
Which has profound significance for us. I know that churches that are like really kind of like on lock with their observance of the church calendar will even use different types of wine throughout the year. So like during Lent, we'll use more bitter wines that aren't as enjoyable, and then on Easter, they're breaking out the really sweet, enjoyable wines and using those throughout the several Sundays of Easter.
Yeah.
There's more symbolism there, but those are some big ones that come to mind. The use of alcohol in the Lord's Supper, one of the arguments that is, I think, really common today is like, well, what about an alcoholic who's in your congregation? And this is one that I think takes like pastoral wisdom. And I'm not going to make like a case that demonizes one or another, but I will say, because I think this is where my thinking's on this these days, I would, and I do, this is not just theory, I do make a case for, even if someone is struggling with alcoholism, I don't think it's the church's responsibility to force that person to drink wine. I think that's ridiculous, because I think maybe being forced to drink wine would potentially result in some sort of relapse. Yeah. But I would encourage someone who is coming to the Lord's table to not see that as any opportunity or occasion for sin or destruction or God allowing something to happen to you that would be detrimental to you. Like, we approach the Lord's table in faith, and for one, the way that our churches take communion, you couldn't get drunk at the Lord's table. I think the question is, really, I think this is in kind of the wake of like AA being a big thing, where like total what's the word, abstention, like from the abstinence from alcohol is what is pushed, right? And so, like, you know, I've gone to church with I'm thinking of one brother of mine that hasn't had alcohol touch his lips in something like 30 years, right? Yeah. So it would be like this really big deal for him, I think, to taste wine even in communion. My like cautious encouragement, not just like blanket, but I think if I was speaking to someone even in my congregation who had a question about this, it would be, this is an opportunity to receive Christ in faith, which is the whole thing that we're doing with communion.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider how this conversation reflects and speaks on what certain traditions have to say about communion, right? Because I remember we had a really great conversation with a handful of other pastors maybe a year or so ago at TGC, where a handful of dudes from different traditions kind of shared their view, where we had our Lutheran buddy, Mr. Palmer, who we already mentioned, sharing the Lutheran perspective of the Lord's Supper, which is kind of similar to the Orthodox view, then the Reformed view, then the Baptist view. And, you know, if you add the Catholic one beyond the Lutheran one, that kind of is the spectrum of like where they feel about certain things. So it makes sense as to why Baptists tends to be, just by default, not pointing fingers, the most loose with replacing the elements, because if
it's just supposed to induce memory,
right, they only see it as a helpful ritual done to intellectually remind yourself of the sacrifice of Jesus. Whereas if you kind of move down that spectrum, the next one would be kind of the Reformed view, which is, it is a remembrance, but it is also a receiving of Christ and a receiving of a spiritual blessing. And then when you get more high church, like Anglican, Orthodox, Catholic, then you have varying forms of Christ's presence. And then with the Roman Catholicism, you have Jesus Christ's true full presence. Right. So I think that for me, I think that because I don't assign the presence of Christ to the elements themselves.
You mean physical presence?
Yeah. Since I don't assign the physical presence of Christ to the elements, I think I don't know. And this is like a slippery slope if you're not careful, but I think I do kind of think God extends a lot of grace to it. And I don't know if I can say during the time that I was receiving grape juice instead of wine, if I was receiving like a lesser portion of Christ's cup, because I don't know, like I've seen Christ's faithfulness throughout my life. Yeah. I don't want to think to myself, well, shoot, I'd be a little bit better off if it wasn't for that Welch's, you know? Yeah. So it's an interesting kind of balance. At the same time, I do think, you know, I have this memory all the time. I used to work at in a behavioral health clinic for young adults with kind of severe behavioral issues. And every morning we would line the kids up and they would all kind of take their prescribed meds, which were often like for ADHD or for psychotic behaviors or for bipolar, etc. And so people would just come, they'd get their little cup of pills, they'd throw it back, they'd throw back a cup of water, and they just go back to wherever they were, the rec room or whatever. And it just like, it started to remind me of how people took the Lord's Supper, where it's just like, all right, it's the first week of the month, time to get in line and, you know, throw back the bread, wash it down with some wine, get back to my seat, go back to thinking about what I'm going to do on Monday morning and get ready for work. And should I grab groceries on the way home, or, you know, how do I want to meal plan this week, yada, yada. And it's just like, there's so much of a removal of what it is. And I think so much of that is because when your tradition tells you that you are taking communion as a way for you to remember something, then it kind of takes away the personal nature of God using it to engage with you. But when you think, I am receiving something that Christ is giving me as I receive these elements, then it's not, I have this responsibility to remember this thing, or now it's, I am just receiving something beautiful and I can let that affect me rather than just me being like, it's not just remembering somebody's birthday, you know, there's like a little more meat to it.
Absolutely.
And so I remember telling my people one time, I was like, guys, please don't just come up here and take your pill and wash it down and just do it because it's just some vitamin you have to take. Like, the Lord's Supper is not a vitamin. Like, this is, you know, this is one of the last things Jesus said to his disciples before he was crucified. Like, he wanted to highlight the significance of this, not because he's like, this is a rule you better not break, but because he's like, I want to consistently give you a foreshadowing of the New Jerusalem to come. Like, I want you to constantly have in the forefront of your minds just how beautiful it's going to be when we feast together, when healing has come to restore this broken world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as Calvinists, our emphasis on the elements being beneficial to us by faith is highlighted in the reality that no matter what type of practice your church has, there's faithless and faithful ways to engage with it.
Yeah.
So if you're doing grape juice and a thin slice of styrofoam, there's faithful and faithless ways to engage with that. On the other end of the spectrum, I was visiting a church one time, and this church practices a common cup, like high symbolism. And whenever I'm in an environment like that, like, I'm really attentive to the liturgy and what we're doing. For one, because it's a little bit different than how I do it at my church, and so I'm wanting to make sure we're doing stuff the way that they want. But anytime I've ever been in a church with a common cup, it's highly significant to me, and draws my attention to what's going on. I was in one of these churches one time, and I was watching someone who had grown up in that environment, in that church, and I had taken communion with me and my family and my kids, and we went and sat down, and I watched this young man walk up who had been, actually I saw two different young men from two different families in this church do this, and they got the bread, ate the bread, they walked over to the deacon that was serving the wine, and they drink the wine out of the cup, and they walk off while the deacon's still talking to them.
Oh, jeez.
And I just saw that, like, raise the eyebrows of the deacon both times, and I just thought, well, here it is. Even in the high symbolism environment, I'm not saying that those young men weren't taking it by faith, but there's a chance that they weren't, that they were just, phoning it in.
Sure.
Having been around this symbolism for so long, they were losing sight of it. Now, I don't make a case for, just because that can happen, that we should walk back symbolism. I think that's dumb. Yeah. But it's interesting to reflect on either way.
Well, even when you think back to like the Old Testament and how the people of Israel were kind of called to keep their festivals and their rituals, like symbolism is always only as meaningful. Well, okay, I'll be careful with saying that. There is a responsibility of the participant to give meaning to a symbol, because if we don't give it that, then yeah, we can kind of desecrate that, and that's not what we should do.
Yeah, that just made me think of 1 Corinthians 10:4, which says, it's talking about the people of Israel wandering in the wilderness, and it says, here, I'm going to read you 1 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 2. No. I'll read from verse 1. He says, I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food. Paedo-communion argument verse right there.
There we go again.
And all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that just goes to show that the symbolism that's there, the rich symbolism, even I would say more than symbolism that's occurring, this nourishment that comes from God, will be meaningless for you without faith. And not just meaningless, but actually could bring about destruction.
Sure. Closing thoughts, dude. The abolitionists were all about removing one thing from the world to make the world a utopia. If you could remove one thing from the world to make the world a utopia, what would it be, Tommy?
Probably vapes.
Yeah, I was going to say Zins.
No.
Sorry, man.
Wow.
No, I stand by it. Yeah. Putting that tea bag in your mouth.
Dumb.
Hey, well, thanks, everybody. We got to talk to you guys later.
God bless you.